Hi, I'm Ellen Berryman. I'm a terrestrial biologist, and I am going to be focusing on the greater Sandhill crane, not talking so much about the overall conservation strategy, but more about the effects and what we're working on now to try and reduce those effects. First, I'm going to give some background on the distribution and habitat requirements for the greater Sandhill crane. Then I'm going to describe the impacts related to BDCP covered activities, and then a couple of key issues that we've identified that are of ongoing concern related to the impacts to the crane and measures that we're working on to reduce those effects. So the greater Sandhill crane is a state-listed threatened species. There are about 80,000 birds throughout North America in the various different flyways. But in the Pacific flyway, they breed in Washington, Oregon, and far northern California, up in the corner, north corner there, that's their breeding range in California. There are about 12,500 birds in the Pacific flyway. And they about 10,000 spend the winter in the Central Valley from September through mid-March. The remainder go down into the Salton Sea area. And then of those 10,000, about 2,000 winter in the Delta. The habitat for the crane during its winter season consists of areas that are used exclusively for foraging and areas that are used for both roosting and foraging. So in the plan area, the foraging habitat consists of croplands and irrigated pasture, with corn being the highest value crop type for the crane. Rice is also high. Things like orchards and vineyards don't provide any habitat value. And then for the roosting and foraging habitat, they need to have flooding, water about 3 to 8 inches deep, and this is either managed wetlands or flooded agricultural fields. So they spend the night in these flooded areas that protect them from predators. And for the purpose of our analysis, we divided the roost sites into what we call the temporary roost sites and the permanent. And the temporary are those that over the years they've been shown to be used only sporadically based on cropping patterns and flooding patterns. And then the permanent roost sites are those that have been shown to be used consistently throughout the years by the cranes. This map shows the habitat for the cranes in the plan area. The green is the foraging habitat. The blue are those roost sites that are used sporadically, and the red are the roost sites that are used on a more consistent basis. And to the right you can see the habitat in relation to the plan area. The area used by cranes was delineated by Gary Ivey, species expert who's been working with us a lot and has been studying the cranes in the Delta for a number of years. This is the habitat loss, the acreages of habitat loss anticipated from all BDCP covered activities, including both the conveyance facility construction and habitat restoration, such as tidal restoration. So down at the bottom, you can see that there would be permanent loss of 4,760 acres of habitat, and then there would be loss of 2,347 acres due to storage of the reusable tunnel material. And this is the material that they pull out of the tunnels. We call it RTM. And this was treated as a permanent impact in the plan, even though it's most likely that this material will be reused for things like levee repair and tidal restoration. And so the material will be moved off the site and those areas will be restored to previous condition. And then 183 acres lost to borrow and spoil, and 802 to other construction-related activities. So those are the temporary impacts that the areas will be restored to their previous condition following construction. And you can see that most of the loss is to foraging habitat. There is some loss to those roost sites that are used on a sporadic basis, and a very small amount, 8 acres of temporary loss to the more permanent roost sites. So we identified 2 key issues related to impacts to the sandhill crane that we're continuing to work on to minimize the impacts. One is that the new conveyance facility alignment goes through Staten Island, which is of concern because it's a very cranes use. There's a high density of cranes that use that area. And then the other issue is related to increased bird strike risk from the transmission lines that are powering the conveyance facility. So I'll start off talking about Staten Island. This is Staten Island here, and that line that goes through the middle is the tunnel, but that's all subsurface impact, so that wouldn't be a surface impact. But up towards the north of the island, there's a vent shaft, or not a vent shaft, but a shaft to pull out reusable tunnel material. And then there would be a conveyor belt that runs from there to the south end of the island, where there would be further storage of the reusable tunnel material, or RTM. And then there would be a work area and vent shaft at the very north end of the island, a work area towards the middle, and then another vent shaft down at the bottom. This map was developed for the purpose of the bird strike analysis, but I thought it was good to illustrate bird densities because the darker blue represents the highest density areas. And you can see in the center there, that's the darkest blue is the Staten Island area. So we were concerned not just with the habitat loss, but also potential indirect impacts. This is an example of what we did for the indirect impact analysis, where we looked at the types of activities and construction equipment that would be used in various locations and predicted the noise levels that would be generated in those areas and drew 10 decibel contour intervals ranging from 40 to 80 decibels. We don't have good data on the effects of noise on sandhill cranes at various noise levels, but everything above 50 dB is considered to be above baseline. So we considered everything above dB to be a potential effect on the crane. And this is for the whole plan area, not just Staten Island, but it shows how we estimated the acreages that would be affected within each 10 decibel contour interval. And we looked at it both for the pile drivers, which would have more punctuated periodic noise, and then for general construction noise. So we identified that there were these impacts, both habitat loss and indirect effects on Staten Island, that were of concern that we needed to continue working on between the public review and the final. And so for the public review draft, we developed a performance standard of no net loss of crane use days on Staten Island. And we have a menu of measures that would be implemented in order to meet the standard. It includes minimizing or shifting the footprint of activities on Staten Island, such as reducing the amount of RTM storage or moving it up into areas that have less density of cranes, such as the northern portion, minimizing noise, lighting, and visual disturbances during construction, and minimizing construction activity and RTM storage during the crane wintering season, trying to do as much as possible when the cranes aren't there. We're also looking at supplemental feeding and foraging habitat enhancement, and what they do this for cranes in other parts of the country. But what this consists of is, in the cornfields, what the cranes normally feed on is just the waste corn that's left over after the harvest. But you can take areas and not harvest the crane and just not harvest the corn and just bump the corn down to make it accessible for the cranes. And so you have a lot more food availability and more capacity to support cranes. And then the last measure is maintaining the flooding and irrigation capacity. This is just about, during construction, making sure that we're not disrupting the flooding patterns that are necessary to sustain the roosting habitat for the cranes. This slide goes into how we would use the crane use days to get at that no net loss in crane use days performance standard. They're already starting to do this monitoring on Staten Island. TNC is the Nature Conservancy. But what would happen would be that the number of crane use days per acre would be estimated by habitat type during this monitoring prior to construction. And then that would be used to predict the number of lost crane use days within the direct and indirect impact footprint once the footprint has been reduced as much as possible. And then this will be used to guide decisions regarding enhancements that are needed on other portions of the island to make up for the loss of crane use days. Now I'm moving on to the transmission line analysis. This analysis was done mostly by Gary Ivey, the crane expert I mentioned earlier. And he developed a risk index based on proximity to roost sites and density of cranes in the roost sites, because most of the strikes happen when birds are moving between roost sites and foraging sites, or when they're flushed during the night from their roost sites. And he overlaid the transmission line alignment over it. The dark line at the top is the permanent transmission lines. Can you see those? And those are the lines that are going to be used during operation, both construction and operation. And then, can you see the yellow lines? Okay. So the yellow lines, there's one that goes from around the Twin Cities Road area to the very north end of Staten Island, and then another that goes from the south end of Staten Island down to Clifton Court. And those are the lines that are just going to be used during construction, and they'll be removed after construction. Since we recognize that there's opportunity to move the transmission line to realign the final transmission line alignment between the public review and the final, and to implement other measures to reduce bird strike risk, we developed a performance standard in the public review draft for no net increase in bird strike risk using the indices developed by Gary Ivey. And we came up with a menu of options to achieve the standard. One is to site the new lines in the lowest risk areas as possible. To remove, relocate, or underground existing lines in high risk areas. For example, there's a line that currently goes through the middle of Staten Island that if that was to be removed or undergrounded, it would go a long ways towards compensating for any increased risk from the new lines. And also installing bird strike diverters on existing lines and all the new lines in the risk zones. And there was already an assessment done identifying lines that would be good to put diverters on that are currently existing. Another measure that can be implemented, and this is for those roost sites that are used sporadically, to discontinue flooding prior to construction in areas that are in really high risk areas, and to flood areas a little further away, close enough that the cranes will be able to find it, but further away from the lines. Now I'm going to be talking about what we're currently working on to address those issues at both Staten Island and for the transmission lines. So for Staten Island, we're coordinating with the wildlife agencies and the species experts and revising the footprint for the reusable tunnel material on Staten Island. It looks like we can probably shrink it down quite a bit and move some of it to the areas in the northern end that are used a lot less by the cranes. We're also developing a strategy for RTM reuse, identifying donor sites in order to minimize storage time of RTM. And we're looking at ways to minimize activities during the winter and try and, as much as possible, do construction when the cranes aren't there. We're also refining the habitat enhancement strategy and developing monitoring and adaptive management measures to ensure that that performance standard of no net loss of crane use days can be met. We're also, I haven't talked about the larger long-term conservation strategy for the crane, where we're protecting thousands of acres of foraging habitat and creating roost sites. That we are working with the crane. We've put together a crane technical advisory committee to assist us with the larger long-term strategy. It's made up of species experts and land use managers in the Delta. And one of the things that the committee is looking at is what really is the long-term role of Staten Island, since it is heavily subsided and vulnerable to sea level rise. Is it really a good thing to have the highest concentration of cranes in that area? Even though we're committed to protecting that, we're looking at a long-term strategy that will likely involve expanding the crane populations into areas less vulnerable to subsidence and sea level rise to the east. And for the transmission lines, we're undergoing a process of identifying existing lines to target for undergrounding. And we're also developing a formal process for DWR, the power provider, species experts, and the wildlife agencies to review alternative alignments for the final transmission line alignment and analyze potential impacts, we're developing a decision-making process to ensure that standard of no net increase in bird strike risk can be met. That's it. Questions?
I do have a question, and that is, it seems like Staten Island is becoming a very important area as far as, especially with construction of the tunnels as well as this crane. Have you looked at the stability of the levees around there to ensure that those levees are not going to break during that time? Has there been analysis of the levees structure
Levee
there?
break during construction? I mean, there has been talk of using the RTM to reinforce the levees around Staten Island. But in terms of engineering issues related to levee break during construction, I guess that's an engineer question.
Yeah, I'm not sure any of us up here are qualified to answer that, but DWR has published an EIR a few years back looking at Staten Island and other areas surrounding it and the flood management potential for that area. So actually that was one of the reasons that the tunnel was realigned to coincide with Staten Island to provide opportunities to help implement that flood control program. And having the reusable tunnel material right there, provides immediate opportunities to help stabilize those levees potentially.
I would just say, just a feedback that I think that's really important, especially when you're talking about maybe making the lines go underground This is a place where you want to make sure it doesn't flood, and especially if you've got all this construction going on and it's a location where you have a high population of cranes in that area.
Any other questions?